I stood by the stove, stirring the thick tomato sauce, the scent of garlic and basil filling my small but cozy kitchen. Cooking had become my solace since my divorce 6 months ago. A way to keep myself occupied, to silence the lingering doubts and loneliness that crept in when the house grew too quiet. My ex-husband had always preferred takeout and late nights with his friends over home-cooked meals, so in a way I was reclaiming something for myself. I had just added a pinch of salt when the doorbell rang. I frowned, glancing at the clock. It was late for visitors. Wiping my hands on a towel, I made my way to the front door and opened it, surprised to find my nephew Daniel standing on the porch. "Daniel," I said, stepping aside to let him in. "What are you doing here this late?" He looked hesitant, shifting his weight from one foot to the other. "Hey, Aunt Clara. I just needed to get out of the house for a bit." I studied him carefully. Daniel had grown so much in the past few years. At 17 he was tall, almost towering over me now, his once boyish face sharpening into adulthood. He had my sister's dark eyes, deep and expressive, and a quiet intensity that reminded me of her. Losing her had been devastating, and I had worried about how he was coping. His father was a decent man, but grief had a way of isolating people. "Come in," I said gently, closing the door behind him. "I'm just making dinner. Have you eaten?" He shook his head. "Not really." I smiled. "Well, you're in luck. I made pasta. Come sit." He followed me into the kitchen, his eyes scanning the space. I had always prided myself on making my home warm and inviting. Soft, golden light bathed the room, the wooden shelves lined with small plants and spice jars. A vase of fresh roses sat in the center of the dining table, their petals a deep, romantic red. Daniel sat down, resting his elbows on the counter as I moved around the kitchen. "How are you holding up?" I asked, glancing at him. He sighed, running a hand through his dark hair. "I don't know. He's been distant. I guess he's trying his best, but it's like he's not really there, you know?" I nodded, understanding all too well. "Grief does that to people." "Yeah," he muttered, looking down at the countertop. "And I feel like everyone expects me to just move on, act normal. But I can't." I turned off the stove and set 2 plates on the counter, placing a generous serving of pasta in front of him. "No one should expect that of you, Daniel. You lost your mom. That's not something you just get over." His gaze met mine then, and for a moment he looked like the little boy I used to babysit, the one who clung to my hand at the park, who begged me to read him stories at bedtime. But he wasn't a child anymore. He had grown, and the weight of life was pressing down on him in ways I wished I could protect him from. He picked up his fork and twirled the pasta absently. "You always know what to say," he murmured. "It's nice being here. Feels normal." Warmth spread through me at his words. "You're welcome here anytime, sweetheart. You know that." We ate in companionable silence for a while, the occasional clink of forks against plates the only sound. I could feel his eyes on me now and then, but I didn't think much of it. After dinner I made tea and we moved to the living room. Daniel stretched out on the couch, looking more at ease than he had when he arrived. I curled up in my armchair, tucking my feet beneath me, sipping from my mug. "You look different," he said suddenly, his voice quieter than before. I raised an eyebrow. "Different how?" He hesitated before answering. "I don't know. Lighter maybe. I mean, after everything. I guess I expected you to be more closed off. But you're still..." I smiled softly. "I try to be. Life doesn't stop no matter how much we want it to." He nodded slowly. "You're stronger than I am." "That's not true," I said, setting my mug down. "You're strong in your own way. You came here tonight instead of bottling everything up. That takes strength." His eyes lingered on mine, something unreadable flickering behind them. "I missed you," he admitted, his voice barely above a whisper. I felt a pang in my chest. "I missed you too, Danny." The clock chimed softly, marking the late hour. He sighed, stretching. "I should probably get going." "You can stay if you want," I offered. "The guest room is always ready." For a moment he seemed to consider it, but then he stood. "Thanks, Aunt Claire. I might take you up on that another time." I walked him to the door, the cool night air brushing against us as I opened it. He hesitated before stepping outside, turning back to look at me. "Good night," he said, his voice gentle. "Good night, sweetheart," I replied, reaching up to ruffle his hair like I used to when he was younger. He smiled. A real, genuine smile, and then he was gone, disappearing into the night. I closed the door, exhaling softly. There was something about tonight that felt different, but I couldn't quite put my finger on it. Maybe it was just the simple joy of reconnecting, of being needed by someone I loved. Or maybe it was something else entirely. The next day passed slower than usual, my thoughts drifting back to Daniel more times than I cared to admit. I wasn't sure why his visit had left such an impression on me. Maybe it was the way he had confided in me so openly, or how his presence had made my home feel a little less empty. I liked having him around. It felt natural, comfortable. And when I received his message that afternoon, a warmth spread through me. Daniel, I need your help. I'll come over tonight if you're not busy. I smiled at my phone before typing back. Of course. Come by any time. The rest of the day I found myself anticipating his arrival. I busied myself tidying up the house, lighting a few candles in the living room, and even brushing my hair more than necessary. By the time evening arrived, I was more excited than I probably should have been. When the doorbell rang, I smoothed my hands over my dress and opened the door. Daniel stood there, looking more put together than usual. He wore a fitted navy blue button-down, the sleeves rolled up just enough to reveal his forearms, and dark jeans that fit him well. His hair was neatly styled, and as he stepped inside, I caught the scent of his cologne, something fresh with a hint of spice. You look nice, I remarked, closing the door behind him. He grinned, holding up a bottle of wine. Figured if I'm coming to you for advice, I should at least bring something. I chuckled, taking the bottle from him. A bribe, huh? Smart man. As I led him into the kitchen, I couldn't help but notice the way he moved. More confident than usual, yet there was still an underlying tension in his shoulders. Something was on his mind. I poured us each a glass of wine and motioned for him to sit. All right, Danny, tell me what's going on. He exhaled slowly, running a hand through his hair. So, there's this girl, Emma. We've been dating for about 6 months. I nodded, taking a sip of my wine. That's great. You never mentioned her before. I know, he said, shifting in his seat. Just, I didn't think it was a big deal at first. But now she invited me to stay over tomorrow night. I raised an eyebrow, understanding dawning on me. Oh. Yeah, he sighed, swirling the wine in his glass. It's gonna be my first time. I tilted my head, watching him. His usual confidence was gone, replaced by uncertainty. And you're nervous about it? Yeah, he admitted. I don't have anyone to talk to about this. I can't ask Dad, God no. And my friends would just make fun of me. He looked up at me then, his dark eyes searching mine. I trust you. His words warmed me more than the wine. I reached across the table, placing a reassuring hand over his. Danny, first of all, there's nothing wrong with being nervous. It just means you care. He exhaled, nodding slightly. I do. I really like her. I don't want to mess this up. I squeezed his hand gently before pulling away. Tell me, what exactly are you worried about? He looked down, fiddling with the stem of his glass. I don't know, everything. What if I do something wrong? What if she doesn't like it? What if I make a fool of myself? I smiled softly. Danny, listen to me. No one is perfect their first time. It's about being present, about caring for the other person. It's not about being some kind of expert. He let out a short laugh. Easy for you to say. I chuckled. All right, let's break this down. First, does she know it's your first time? He hesitated. No. Should I tell her? That depends on you. Some people prefer to be open about it while others don't. But if you trust her, she'll be understanding. It might even take some of the pressure off. He nodded thoughtfully. And what if I don't know what to do? I smiled, sipping my wine before answering. You don't need to know everything, Danny. Just pay attention to her. Communication is key. If you're unsure, ask. And go slow, there's no rush. He nodded again, absorbing my words. Okay, and what if she expects me to be, good at it? I laughed softly. Oh, sweetheart. No one expects a first time to be perfect. And if she really likes you, she'll be more focused on the moment, not on whether you're an expert. It's about connection, not performance. His shoulders seemed to relax a little. Yeah. I guess you're right. I tilted my head, studying him for a moment. Danny, I think you're putting too much pressure on yourself. This isn't something to win at. Something to experience. And if it's with the right person, it'll feel natural. His lips curved into a small smile. I never thought I'd be having this conversation with you. I laughed. Well, I'm honored you trust me enough to ask. He held my gaze for a moment before chuckling softly. You're really good at making people feel comfortable. I shrugged. It's a gift. We finished our wine, the conversation drifting to lighter topics, and by the time he was ready to leave he looked more at ease. At the door he hesitated. Thanks, Aunt Claire. For everything. Anytime, sweetheart, I said, squeezing his arm. And remember, don't overthink it. Just be yourself. He nodded, and for a brief moment I saw something in his eyes. An emotion I couldn't quite place. But before I could dwell on it, he smiled, gave me one last appreciative look and stepped out into the night. As I closed the door behind him, I let out a slow breath. There was something different about tonight, something lingering in the air. And for the first time in a long time, I realized how much I had missed the feeling of being needed. I had barely taken a step away from the door when I heard it again. The unmistakable sound of knuckles rapping lightly against the wood. My heart gave a small, startled jump. I turned back, a strange mix of curiosity and something deeper stirring inside me. When I opened the door, there he was. Daniel stood in the dim glow of my porch light, his hands at his sides, his breathing a little uneven as if he had been debating with himself before knocking. The cool night air ruffled his dark hair slightly, casting shadows across his sharp features. His expression was unreadable, his deep eyes searching mine for something. An answer, permission, understanding. Daniel. My voice came out softer than I intended. Did you forget something? He didn't answer right away. Instead, he hesitated for just a fraction of a second, his gaze flickering down for a moment before meeting mine again with quiet determination. And then, before I could process what was happening, he stepped forward. His hand reached up gently, fingers brushing my cheek with a hesitation that told me he was testing the moment, waiting for me to pull away. But I didn't. I couldn't. My breath caught in my throat as his touch sent warmth trickling through my skin, a slow and unexpected burn. His other hand found my waist, feather-light but steady, and then with an almost reverent slowness he leaned in. His lips met mine in a kiss that was neither hurried nor forceful. Just soft, uncertain, and yet somehow deeply intent. A sharp intake of breath escaped me, though I wasn't sure if it was from surprise or something else entirely. His lips lingered, gentle but undeniably real, the warmth of his body radiating so close to mine. Time seemed to stall, the world around us narrowing to just this. The quiet night, the faint hum of crickets in the distance, and the sheer, unspoken weight of what was unfolding between us. But then reality snapped back into place. I broke away, my breath shaky, my mind spinning. Daniel, I whispered, my fingers brushing over my lips as if to confirm that the moment had really happened. He looked at me, his expression vulnerable, conflicted, his chest rising and falling slightly faster than before. I'm sorry, he murmured, though there was no regret in his voice, only uncertainty. I couldn't leave without. He trailed off, running a hand through his hair, exhaling sharply as he looked away for the briefest second before his eyes found mine again. I don't know what's wrong with me, he admitted, his voice thick with something I couldn't quite define. I know I shouldn't have done that, but I wanted to. I've wanted to for a while now. His words sent a shiver through me, not of fear but of realization. This wasn't a fleeting impulse. I had thought about this before. I opened my mouth to speak, but the words wouldn't come. 1,000 reasons why this was a mistake flashed through my mind, but they felt distant, muted against the intensity of what had just happened. Finally, I found my voice. Daniel, you're confused. His jaw tightened slightly. Am I? I swallowed. You've been through a lot. Losing your mom, dealing with your dad, feeling alone. It's not that, he cut in, shaking his head. It's not just about needing someone. It's Claire. It's always been you. His words sent my pulse skittering. You don't mean that, I whispered, but even as I said it, I wasn't sure if I believed it myself. He stepped closer again, just enough that I could feel his warmth. I do. Silence stretched between us, thick and heavy. Then, with visible effort, he let out a slow breath and stepped back, as if forcing himself to create space where there had been none. I know this isn't fair to you, he said, his voice quieter now, tinged with something that sounded like resignation. And I'm not expecting you to say anything. I couldn't leave without letting you know. Without, he exhaled again, shaking his head. Without knowing if you felt something too. I looked at him, truly looked at him, and I saw the boy I had once cradled in my arms after my sister's funeral. The teenager who had once clung to me when his world had shattered. The young man now standing before me vulnerable and raw. And the truth settled over me like a whispered secret. I had felt something. A warmth, a longing, an ache I wasn't supposed to acknowledge. I pressed my lips together, my heart pounding in my chest. Daniel, this can't happen. A flicker of hurt crossed his face, but he nodded as if he had expected my answer. I know. His eyes lingered on mine for a moment longer, then he gave me a small, sad smile. Good night, Clara. And with that he turned and walked away, disappearing into the night. I stood there, frozen in my doorway, the ghost of his kiss still lingering on my lips, my heart caught in a battle between reason and something far more dangerous. And as the night swallowed him, I realized, this wasn't over. Not by a long shot.